November 2017. Luanda, Angola. In the final hours before dawn, a transaction flashes across international banking systems. $38 million flowing from Sonangol, Angola's state oil company, to a shell company in Dubai. The recipient? A consulting firm called Matter Business Solutions. The timing? Hours after Angola's new president had just fired the woman who'd been running Sonangol. Her name was Isabel dos Santos, and she wasn't just any executive. She was the daughter of the man who'd ruled Angola for 38 years. By the time investigators pieced together what had happened, they would discover something extraordinary. Isabel dos Santos had built an empire spanning more than 400 companies across 41 countries. She'd been called Africa's richest woman, worth over $2 billion. And almost none of it was hers. To understand how Isabel dos Santos became one of the world's most notorious kleptocrats, you have to understand Angola. Angola sits on Africa's southwestern coast. It's a country blessed with staggering natural wealth, diamonds, oil, minerals that should have made it one of the continent's most prosperous nations. Instead, according to the United Nations Human Development Index, Angola ranks 149th in the world, a score of 0.526. Life expectancy, 61 years. Nearly half the population lives in poverty. Children die from preventable diseases. Schools crumble. Hospitals lack basic supplies. This is one of the world's poorest countries, sitting on some of the world's greatest wealth. The reason lies in a single date, September 10, 1979. That's when José Eduardo dos Santos became president of Angola. He was 37 years old. He would rule for the next 38 years. Think about that for a moment. 38 years. Margaret Thatcher served 11 years. François Mitterrand served 14. José Eduardo dos Santos outlasted them all. And during that time, he built something that would become a blueprint for 21st century kleptocracy. Isabel dos Santos was born in 1973 in Baku, Azerbaijan, where her father was studying petroleum engineering in the Soviet Union. She grew up as royalty in all but name. By her early 20s, she was already acquiring stakes in Angolan companies, banks, telecommunications, media outlets. The official story? She was a savvy entrepreneur, a business genius who'd built her fortune through hard work and smart investments. But here's what investigators would later discover. Nearly every major business deal Isabel dos Santos made involved companies doing business with the Angolan state. Nearly every significant asset she acquired came through partnerships where the government was the other party. In 2013, she acquired a 25% stake in Unitel, Angola's largest mobile phone company. The company had a near monopoly. It was hugely profitable, and the Angolan government was a major stakeholder. In 2016, Forbes magazine named her Africa's richest woman. Net worth? Over $2 billion. She lived in luxury that would make oil sheiks envious. Mansions in London, penthouses in Dubai, a yacht, private jets, designer clothes and jewelry worth millions. Meanwhile, back in Angola, mothers walked miles to reach clinics with no medicine. Children studied in schools without roofs. But Isabel dos Santos's ascent wasn't complete yet. In June 2016, her father made a decision that would expose everything. He appointed his daughter to run Sonangol. Sonangol isn't just any company. It's the state oil company that controls Angola's most valuable resource, the company that generates the majority of government revenue, the financial lifeblood of the entire nation. And José Eduardo dos Santos had just handed it to his daughter. What happened next would take years to fully understand. But when it finally came to light, it revealed a system of theft so sophisticated, so audacious, that it would change how the world understood modern corruption. In January 2020, the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists published what they called the Luanda Leaks. More than 715,000 documents, internal emails, financial records, banking transactions, contracts. The documents revealed that Isabel dos Santos had constructed an empire of more than 400 companies and subsidiaries in 41 countries. At least 94 of these were registered in secrecy jurisdictions: Malta, Mauritius, Hong Kong, the British Virgin Islands. This story is just getting deeper. If this shocks you already, hit subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Let me show you exactly how it worked. November 2017, Isabel dos Santos had been running Sonangol for 18 months. But Angola had just inaugurated a new president, João Lourenço, and one of his first acts was to fire her. Hours after her dismissal, according to the leaked documents, Sonangol transferred $38 million to a Dubai-based consulting firm called Matter Business Solutions, DMCC. Here's what investigators discovered about Matter Business Solutions. It was controlled by a close associate of Isabel dos Santos. It had been set up specifically to receive payments from Sonangol, and it had previously operated under another name, Iron Sea Consulting. But the $38 million was just the beginning. The Luanda Leaks revealed that while Isabel dos Santos ran Sonangol, the state oil company had made a series of payments to consulting firms. Boston Consulting Group received $31.2 million. PricewaterhouseCoopers received $21.4 million. McKinsey & Company received $15.4 million. Consulting fees, they called them, for restructuring advice, strategic planning. But the Luanda Leaks showed these payments flowing through the same Dubai shell company network connected to Isabel dos Santos. According to court documents filed by Angolan prosecutors, Isabel dos Santos and her associates used forged documents and director mismanagement to illegally siphon 52.6 million euros from Sonangol. Total state losses from her time running the oil company? $219 million. But Sonangol was just one piece of a far larger puzzle. The leaked documents revealed a sophisticated network of shell companies designed to move money out of Angola and into Isabel dos Santos's control. In Malta, Wise Intelligence Solutions, Alcia Limited. In Mauritius, Saguaro Management Limited. In the Netherlands, multiple holding companies controlling stakes in Portuguese and Angolan businesses. In the British Virgin Islands, dozens of entities with opaque ownership structures. Each company was a layer. Each layer made it harder to trace where the money came from and where it was going. Here's how it typically worked. An Angolan state company would award a contract. That contract would go to a company owned by Isabel dos Santos. But her ownership would be hidden behind shell companies in Malta or Mauritius. The profits would flow offshore, and the Angolan people would see nothing. Let me give you a specific example. FASEC, a Portuguese engineering company, held contracts worth hundreds of millions to build infrastructure in Angola. Power plants, electrical grids, the work Angola desperately needed. Isabel dos Santos owned 65% of FASEC, through shell companies, through layers of offshore entities. When FASEC won Angolan government contracts, she profited twice. Once from the contracts themselves, and again from her ownership stake in the company. The same pattern appeared again and again. Unitel, the telecom company. Banco BPI in Portugal. Banco BIC in Angola. Real estate developments. Diamond mining operations. Everywhere you looked, Isabel dos Santos's companies were doing business with the Angolan state. And everywhere you looked, public money was flowing into private offshore accounts. If you're thinking this sounds extraordinary, you're right. But if you're thinking it sounds unique, you're wrong. Because Isabel dos Santos's story isn't an aberration. It's a pattern. one that's been repeated across Africa for decades. Angola itself had seen this before. General Sani Abacha of Nigeria stole an estimated $5 billion during his 5-year rule in the 1990s. Mobutu Sese Seko of Zaire, now the Democratic Republic of Congo, looted an estimated $5 billion over 3 decades. But what makes Isabel dos Santos's case different is how sophisticated it was, how modern. Previous generations of African kleptocrats were crude. They stuffed cash in suitcases. They bought properties in their own names. They left obvious trails. Isabel dos Santos did something different. She built a corporate empire that looked legitimate. She hired Western consultants. She used respected law firms and accounting companies. She gave interviews to Forbes and the Financial Times. She made theft look like business. And she wasn't alone. The Luanda Leaks were just one chapter in a larger story. In 2016, the Panama Papers exposed how politicians and oligarchs worldwide used offshore shell companies to hide wealth. In 2021, the Pandora Papers revealed even more. What these leaks showed was a global infrastructure specifically designed to help wealthy elites hide money. Law firms that specialized in setting up shell companies. Banks that didn't ask questions. Jurisdictions that offered secrecy as a service. Isabel dos Santos didn't invent this system. She just used it better than almost anyone else. Let me put the scale of this into perspective. $2 billion. That's what Isabel dos Santos was worth at her peak. Angola's entire health budget in 2016 was $1.3 billion for a population of 30 million people. Her personal fortune exceeded the country's annual spending on health care for every man, woman, and child in Angola. The infant mortality rate in Angola, 65 deaths per 1,000 births, one of the highest in the world. Life expectancy, 61 years. School enrollment, barely 60% of children complete primary education. While Isabel dos Santos shopped in London and partied in Dubai, Angolan mothers gave birth in clinics with no clean water. While she added millions to her offshore accounts, Angolan children died from malaria because there was no medicine. This wasn't just theft. It was the systematic looting of a nation's future. September 26, 2017. After 38 years in power, José Eduardo dos Santos stepped down as president of Angola. His successor was João Lourenço, a man from within the same political party, but someone who had different ideas about Angola's future. Within weeks, João Lourenço fired Isabel dos Santos from Sonangol. At first, it seemed like a standard political transition. New leader, new appointments. But what came next was anything but standard. João Lourenço launched an anti-corruption campaign. He replaced the head of the Attorney General's office. He ordered investigations into state-owned companies. And he specifically directed prosecutors to examine what had happened at Sonangol during Isabel dos Santos's tenure. In December 2019, Angolan prosecutors filed charges. Isabel dos Santos was charged with 12 crimes: money laundering, embezzlement, tax fraud, forgery of documents, mismanagement. According to the charging documents, she had caused losses to the Angolan state of approximately $219 million. But the real bombshell came a month later. January 19, 2020. The International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, working with journalists from 36 countries, published the Luanda Leaks. 715,000 documents, 2 decades of financial records. The inner workings of Isabel dos Santos's empire laid bare for the world to see. The documents showed exactly how she'd done it. The shell companies, the offshore accounts, the consultants and lawyers who'd helped her, the banks that had processed her transactions. Within days of the publication, Portuguese authorities froze her assets in Portugal. Banks in the Netherlands opened investigations. The Angolan government sought an international asset freeze. In November 2022, Interpol issued a red notice for Isabel dos Santos. An international wanted alert circulated to law enforcement in 194 countries. In December 2021, the United States barred her from entering the country, citing involvement in significant corruption. And in November 2024, the United Kingdom took an extraordinary step. They imposed sanctions on Isabel dos Santos, freezing her British assets and banning her from the country. The UK government called her a notorious kleptocrat. The global asset freeze now stands at $733 million. So here's the question everyone should be asking. Where did the money go? And more importantly, will any of it ever make it back to the Angolan people? $733 million in frozen assets. That's what authorities have managed to identify and freeze in Portugal, the Netherlands, and other jurisdictions. But freezing assets and actually recovering them are two very different things. This story is just getting deeper. If this shocks you already, hit subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Asset recovery in international corruption cases is notoriously difficult. It requires cooperation between multiple countries. It requires navigating different legal systems. And it requires proving, in court, that specific assets were proceeds of crime. Isabel dos Santos's lawyers have fought every step of the way. They've challenged the legality of the asset freezes. They've argued that she's being politically persecuted. They've claimed that her business dealings were legitimate. And the legal battles could drag on for years, maybe decades. Angola has been here before. Remember General Sani Abacha of Nigeria, who stole $5 billion in the 1990s. International authorities have been trying to recover that money for more than 25 years. Some of it has been returned, but much of it is still tied up in legal proceedings. And some of what was returned allegedly disappeared again through new corruption schemes. The problem isn't just recovering the money. It's what happens to it once it's recovered. Civil society organizations in Angola have raised serious concerns. They point out that Angola lacks strong institutional frameworks to ensure recovered funds are used properly. There's limited transparency. There's weak oversight. There's a history of funds disappearing even after they've been repatriated. In other words, there's a very real possibility that even if Isabel dos Santos's stolen billions are eventually recovered, they might never actually reach the schools, hospitals, and infrastructure that Angola so desperately needs. That's the bitter truth about grand corruption. The theft continues long after the thief is caught. But here's what you need to understand. Isabel dos Santos didn't do this alone. She couldn't have. To move hundreds of millions of dollars across international borders, to set up shell companies in multiple jurisdictions, to hide ownership behind layers of offshore entities, she needed help. Professional help. The Luanda Leaks exposed an entire ecosystem of lawyers, accountants, bankers, and consultants who made Isabel dos Santos's empire possible. Let's start with the jurisdictions. Malta. A member of the European Union, known for its favorable tax structures and willingness to host shell companies. Isabel dos Santos had dozens of companies registered there. Mauritius, an island nation that's become a hub for routing money into and out of Africa. Low taxes, minimal disclosure requirements. The British Virgin Islands, perhaps the world's most famous secrecy jurisdiction. No corporate tax, no requirement to disclose beneficial owners. Perfect for hiding who really controls a company. Dubai. The United Arab Emirates has become a magnet for questionable money from across Africa and the Middle East. Minimal financial transparency. No extradition treaties with many countries. a safe haven for those fleeing accountability. These jurisdictions didn't just happen to be where Isabel dos Santos's companies were registered. They actively market themselves as places where wealthy people can hide money. Then there are the banks. To move hundreds of millions of dollars, you need banks willing to process the transactions. Banks that won't ask too many questions about why a shell company in Malta is receiving $38 million from an Angolan state oil company. Now, major financial institutions have compliance departments. They have anti-money laundering obligations. They're supposed to flag suspicious transactions. But somehow, hundreds of millions of dollars flowed through the global banking system without raising enough red flags to stop it. And then there are the consultants. The Luanda Leaks revealed that some of the world's most prestigious consulting firms received payments channeled through Isabel dos Santos's network. Boston Consulting Group, $31.2 million. PricewaterhouseCoopers, $21.4 million. McKinsey & Company, $15.4 million. These firms have said they provided legitimate consulting services. They've said they didn't know about the corruption. They've said they followed all proper procedures. But the Luanda Leaks showed these payments flowing through the same Dubai shell company network that was at the heart of the scheme. This is the dirty secret of 21st century kleptocracy. It's not just corrupt officials in developing countries. It's a global infrastructure built and maintained by some of the world's most respectable institutions. The Panama Papers, the Pandora Papers, the Luanda Leaks. Each new leak reveals the same pattern. Western law firms setting up shell companies, Western banks processing transactions, Western jurisdictions offering secrecy as a product. Isabel dos Santos stole billions from one of the world's poorest countries. But she couldn't have done it without help from some of the world's richest. So where is Isabel dos Santos today? She's in Dubai, living in a country that has no extradition treaty with Angola, a country that's become a haven for wealthy individuals fleeing accountability elsewhere. She hasn't returned to Angola since the charges were filed. She's been barred from entering the United States. She's been sanctioned by the United Kingdom. Interpol has issued a red notice for her arrest, and yet she remains free. Her lawyers continue to fight the charges. They claim she's the victim of political persecution. They argue that all her business dealings were legitimate. They challenge every asset freeze, every investigation, every attempt to hold her accountable. Isabel dos Santos may never face trial. She may never spend a day in prison. She may live out the rest of her life in luxury, protected by international borders and expensive legal teams. Meanwhile, in Angola, children still die from preventable diseases. Schools still crumble. Hospitals still lack basic supplies. The woman who was once called Africa's richest woman sits in Dubai, while the country that made her wealthy remains one of the poorest on earth. Her father, José Eduardo dos Santos, died in July 2022 in Barcelona, Spain. He never faced charges for corruption. He ruled Angola for 38 years and died in exile, a wealthy man. Some of Isabel dos Santos's associates have faced consequences. Some have been charged. Some have had assets seized. But the big fish, the ones who benefited most, remain largely untouchable. This is where the story ends. Except, of course, it doesn't really end. Because Isabel dos Santos's story isn't just about one woman who stole billions. It's about a system that made it possible. A system that continues to exist. A system that enables new Isabel dos Santoses to emerge every day. The shell company havens are still there. Malta, Mauritius, the British Virgin Islands. They're still offering secrecy as a service. The banks that processed hundreds of millions in suspicious transactions are still operating. The consulting firms that took tens of millions in fees are still advising governments and corporations. Dubai is still a haven for those fleeing accountability. And in Angola, a new generation is growing up in a country that should be rich, but remains desperately poor. Picture a mother in Luanda, walking her sick child to a clinic that has no medicine. Picture a student in a school with no roof, studying by sunlight because there's no electricity. Picture farmers in the countryside watching their crops fail because the irrigation systems were never built. These aren't abstract statistics. They're real people, living real lives, paying the real cost of someone else's theft. $2 billion. That's what Isabel dos Santos was worth. $2 billion that could have built hospitals, schools, roads, water systems. $2 billion that could have saved lives. Instead, it bought yachts and penthouses and designer clothes. It sits in frozen bank accounts, fought over by lawyers, while the people who really own it, the people of Angola, wait for justice that may never come. The question isn't just whether Isabel dos Santos will ever face accountability. The question is whether the system that enabled her will ever change. Will the shell company havens close? Will the banks start asking harder questions? Will the jurisdictions that profit from secrecy choose transparency instead? Or will we simply wait for the next leak, the next scandal, the next billion-dollar theft to briefly capture our attention before we move on to the next story? Isabel dos Santos is in Dubai tonight. She's likely living comfortably, protected by borders and money and legal teams. And somewhere in Angola, a child is going to bed hungry, in a country that should be feeding the world. That's the real cost of corruption. Not just the money, the lives.